Good morning. Today, I'm privileged to present to you Dr. Susan Fenn-Royan. She is a laboratory-based hematologist who obtained a postgraduate qualification in hematology from the University of Pretoria in 2012. Following this qualification, she completed a contractual appointment at the National Health Laboratory Service in Polokwane, where she gained valuable experience in laboratory management and diagnostic services. In 2014, Dr. Van Rooyen joined Pathcare for Mark and has remained part of the organization since. Starting with a small practice, she has contributed to its development and growth over the years. She has a keen interest in all aspects of hematology and enjoys the diversity and challenges of the field. Outside of work, Susan enjoys spending time in nature with her family and two much-loved Labradoodles. It's true.
Thank you, Leanne, for the kind introduction and for the conversation. It's a privilege to be here this morning, also to everybody joining here and also online. So without further ado, let's delve into our topic of today, and that's the Philadelphia negative myeloproliferative neoplasms. Right, so what does the myeloproliferative neoplasms have in common? They are clonal disorders due to genetic mutations originating in the myeloid hematopoietic stem cell that leads to the uncontrolled proliferation of mature hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow in the absence of dysplasia. They tend to have chronic inflammation, thrombosis, and vascular complications, but not just that, they have a risk to progress to bone marrow failure and secondary acute myeloid leukemia. So firstly, we can sort of separate the categories according to the BCR-ABL positivity. So if BCR-ABL is positive, it's diagnosed as a chronic myeloid leukemia. And if it is BCR-ABL negative, then it falls under one of the following: either polycythemia vera, essential thrombocythemia, primary myelofibrosis, chronic neutrophilic leukemia, chronic eosinophilic leukemia, or myeloproliferative not otherwise specified. According to the WHO of Tumors of Hematopoietic and Lymphoid Tissue, WHO5, and the International Consensus Classification, these subtypes of the Philadelphia negatives exhibit distinct hematological and molecular characteristics, and there is great emphasis on genetic features because of our advances in next-generation sequencing and PCRs. It has enhanced our understanding based on the mutational landscape of these diseases, but also our ability now to measure variant allele frequencies, which is basically the number of the variant detected at a position per the total number of reads at that position, expressed as a percentage. The importance of integrating these genetic, morphological, and clinical data is to assist us with making accurate diagnoses and also planning effectively for treatment of these myeloproliferative neoplasms. Look at the incidence compared of these three entities. Polycythemia will account for the majority of patients, 50 to 60% of them. Essential thrombocythemia for 20 to 25%, and primary myelofibrosis for about 15 to 20%. Now, these disorders are associated with specific disease driver mutations, and they will be positive in more or less 90% of these patients. These mutations include the JAK2 V617F mutation, where valine is replaced by phenylalanine at position 617, calreticulin, and NPL, or some call it BOL mutations. Up to 10% may be triple negative, and that will be in the primary myelofibrosis and ET groups. If we look at the distribution of these mutations in different entities, we'll see that JAK2 V617 mutations are the most common in all of them. They account for more or less 95% of the mutations that will be found in polycythemia. and about 50 to 60 or 60% in the ET and myelofibrosis groups. If in the polycythemia group, if then JAK2 V617 is negative, there is a possibility that it may be a JAK2 exon 12 mutation, and that occurs in about 2 to 3%. We don't really see the calreticulin and the MPL mutations in the polycythemia group, but the calreticulin mutations, both types 1 and 2, are occurring 20 to 25% in the ET group, and about 20 to 30% in the primary myelofibrosis, where type 1 is more commonly found. MPL is the least found in all the entities, 5 to 7% and 7 to 10% respectively in the ET and primary myelofibrosis. Now, just to get a quick reminder on what JAK2 entails. So JAK2 is associated with several receptors, like erythropoietin or thrombopoietin. It can also be various cytokine receptors, granulocytic choline-stimulating factors, or interleukin-3. And once the ligand now binds to the receptor, JAK2 will be activated, and the whole JAK-STAT pathway will then follow. And once it enters the nucleus, it will obviously assist with transcription and translation, depending on what receptor has been triggered, which leads into cell growth and development, differentiation, histone modification, inflammatory response. When a JAK2 V617 mutation occurs, it is a dominant gain of function mutation that leads to continuous activation then of this receptor and the whole JAK-STAT pathway. It activates both STAT5 and STAT1 signaling pathways. In ET, the STAT1 is upregulated, and that constrains the erythroid differentiation while promoting the megakaryocytic differentiation. Where in polycythemia, the opposite is true, where STAT5 is upregulated with then development of erythrocytosis. Now, looking at the different JAK2 mutations in the different entities and what they look like, JAK2 exon 12 mutations in the PVRI group tends to present at a younger age. These patients tend to have higher hemoglobin levels, lower platelet counts, lower white cell counts at diagnosis, but they unfortunately have a similar risk to thrombosis, progression to myelofibrosis, leukemia, and mortality than the normal JAK2 V617F mutation. In polycythemia, the V617F mutations definitely increase your risk of disease progression, and the higher the VIF percentage, there's also a risk for thrombosis and fibrosis. Small studies has also indicated that a VIF above 75 may increase your cardiovascular risk as well, but that was in a very small study and it's not been found in other studies yet. JAK2 mutations in ETs tend to have higher hemoglobin levels and lower platelet counts with elevated white cell counts, but they also have increased rates of venous thrombosis and leukemic transformations, particularly when it is combined with extreme thrombocytosis and abnormal karyotypes. In primary myelofibrosis, these mutations are linked to higher neutrophil and platelet count diagnosis, a lower likelihood of transfusion dependence, but also potentially poorer survival than compared to the other mutations. If we look at calreticulin, calreticulin is a calcium binding protein, but it's involved in various processes, including calcium storage, transcription regulation, and also functioning as an endoplasmic reticulin chaperone. When the mutation occurs, it can activate thrombopoietin receptor MPL and the JAK-STAT signaling pathway, leading to also a kind of function type of mutation. Patients with calreticulin mutations tend to be younger, and they can present with extremely high platelet counts, often in the 2000s. They are less likely to need transfusions, and they have lower white cell counts, but they also have lower thrombosis risk, interestingly enough, and that better survival than patients with JAK2 mutations. The allele burden in calreticulin has not really been investigated as much, but it has been shown in some studies that higher the VIF is, it's more associated with higher risk molecular mutations, And then primary myelofibrosis, they tend to have lower hemoglobin and platelet counts with leukocytosis. Now, just coming back to the two types of mutation, not to go into too much detail, but the type 1 mutation is a deletion, and it's been more frequently observed in primary myelofibrosis. The type 1 calreticulin mutation is shown to have an overall improved survival compared to the type 2 mutation. And in ET or myelofibrosis patients, harboring the type 1 mutation has shown to be have improved overall survival in a lower risk of thrombosis compared to the JAK2 mutation. Type 2 mutations is often then predominantly associated with essential thrombocythemia, and it's more of an insertion type of mutation. MPL is a gene that encodes for transmembrane protein. It has an extracellular cytokine binding and an intracellular signaling domain, where when thrombopoietin as a ligand binds to the MPL, it will activate cause dimerization and activation again of the JAK-STAT pathway, but is crucial now for megakaryocyte growth and platelet production in this pathway. It also plays a role in self-renewal of the hematopoietic stem cell, and with all the mutations so far have been located on exon 10, and its most common mutations is substitutions at position W515L or K. ET patients with the MPL mutation are shown to have lower HPs with higher platelet counts at diagnosis. They, interestingly enough, have elevated serum erythropoietin levels and are at a higher risk of transformation to fibrosis and secondary acute myeloid leukemia. Now, looking at the triple negative patients in the ET and primary myelofibrosis group, there have been suggestions that there could be rare mutations in JAK2, MPL, and calreticulin that's not routinely detected by diagnostics. However, they have investigated it in the JAK2 mutation, but they found that mutations other than the ones that we are currently known as driver mutations does not have the oncogenic potential. So it does leave the question whether other driver mutations may exist. So in this group, we do rely in these cases on NGS to help us to find some clonal markers to assist in confirming the diagnosis. We know that patients with triple negative primary myelofibrosis tend to have poorer survival with increased leukemic transformation rates, increased vascular events, and patients tend to have lower hemoglobin levels, platelet counts, and leukocyte counts. They also tend to fall more in the higher prognostic scoring risk groups. Does it mean that then when you have a JAK2 mutation that you will necessarily develop a myeloproliferative neoplasm? So, for instance, you acquire a JAK2 V61 mutation in one of your hematopoietic stem cells, and interestingly enough, we do develop about 19 of these mutations per stem cell per year. That's a bit of a nightmarish idea, but luckily, a lot of these mutations will be lost to stemness or eliminated due to immune surveillance. But say this stem cell does survive, and the clone proliferates slightly, and once it becomes detectable in the peripheral bloodstream, we call it a CHIP. A CHIP is a clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential, and usually that's according to the WHO VAF percentages of about 2 or more. So it still does not mean that even if you do have a CHIP, that you will develop a myeloproliferative neoplasm. That will depend basically on whether this clone proliferates to a position where it becomes a dominant clone. And for that to happen, you have to have either genetic predisposition by some of your germline mutations, or you have to acquire additional somatic mutations. And they also say inflammation and aging also contributes to clonal proliferation in this patient. So once the clone proliferates, you develop the myeloproliferative neoplasm. Looking at the timeline, so say they've looked back on patients that have, for instance, JAK2, V617 mutations in polycythemia vera, and found that these patients had a CHIP almost 5 to 15 years before they developed the myeloproliferative neoplasm. So it can be decades since you have the CHIP to develop the disease. And they even looked at phylogenetic data and they found that these even can exist in the pre-chip phase, and that can also be decades. And some even postulate that you can have these mutations even perhaps at childhood. Looking at some of the germline mutations. So to prove a germline mutation, you have to also acquire DNA from other tissue to prove that it is actually inherited. Some families do have a predisposition, and it puts you at about 6 to 8 times more risk of developing a myeloprolif if you have family members. However, it depends on the penetrance of these mutations whether you will develop the disease. Few of these mutations has been discovered, and then also to develop the disease, you have to acquire then all kinds of somatic mutations, and interestingly enough, the majority of them will be present at the diagnosis. So it is worth doing the NGS when the diagnosis is made. And they postulate that some of these, the way that you acquire these mutations, the order that you acquire these mutations may also contribute to what type of disease you develop. And that's probably will still be investigated in future. But just to come back to NGS, we are familiar with it and disease driver mutations and the clonal driver mutations, but sometimes we also find variants of unknown significance. And before, we have to consider that we won't know what the meaning is of these mutations unless we evaluate them, assess them for functional consequences. Once we determine that they have functional consequences, we can then put them in the clonal driver mutation group. But if they do not have any function, then we classify them as passenger mutations. And on average, a patient with primary myelofibrosis will have about 13 mutations per person. ETs and PVRs tend to have about 6.5 mutations per person, but the majority of them will be passenger mutations. So these clonal driver mutations is not just found in the myeloproliferative neoplasms. They are found in almost all of the myeloid neoplasms that you find in the WHO. So some of them have prognostic implications and some of them don't. So looking at the epigenetic regulators, and the ones marked in yellow are all the ones that do have adverse prognostic implications, and some of them are also high-risk mutations. Some do not. The TEC2 and DNMT3A don't have any prognostic implications, but it seems like those mutations put you at risk for being resistant to some of the interferon therapies. Then we also get signaling mutations, splicing mutations, and transcription mutations. The CBL mutation is a JAK signaling regulation, and they say mutations in this group can sometimes prevent or actually you can develop resistance to the JAK2 inhibitors. Some mutations like the SF3B1 is only adverse prognostic in ET. Some are more common in leukemic transformations like NFE2, and then also obviously TP53 is not uncommon in the leukemia groups. Chromosomal abnormalities. We do see quite a few chromosomal abnormalities in the myeloproliferative neoplasms, and they are quite diverse and can vary depending on the specific subtype. The prevalence is about 55% will have some in the primary myelofibrosis group, 20% in the PV group, and 5% in ET. It's seen across various of the myeloproliferative neoplasms. We can find 4q loss, 11q recurrent, 20q deletions, and trisomy 8. Then we see the 1q gain often in a JAK2 B617 mutation in PV and ET. Deletion 17p is more common in primary myelofibrosis and obviously associated with the dysregulation of TP53 pathway. And the 9p gain or trisomy 9 is specific to PV around secondary myelofibrosis. So it's still of value to do chromosomal studies when we diagnose these myeloprolifs because they do contribute to prognostic scoring, and we will not pick them up in GS structural abnormalities. Just a quick overview on the phenotype and how do we classify these diseases phenotypically. So P. vera presents with erythrocytosis, often accompanied by leukocytosis or thrombocytosis. They often have an increased risk of thrombosis or hemorrhagic events. ET presents with persistently elevated platelet counts. They do tend to have increased large, mature, and hyperlobated megakaryocytes in bone marrow. They also have thrombotic or hemorrhagic complications. The primary myelofibrosis group tend to have abnormal megakaryocytes, granulocytic proliferation, so it can progress from a prefibrotic to a fibrotic stage. Where in the prefibrotic, we have hypercellular marrows with minimal fibrosis, and in the fibrotic group, we tend to have advanced fibrosis with erythroblastosis, anemia, splenomegaly, and or hepatomegaly. All three of these entities can progress to either an accelerated phase or a blast phase. The accelerated phase usually is 10 to 19% blast in the peripheral blood or bone marrow. In the blast phase, we have 20% or more blast in the peripheral blood or bone marrow, and that's called an ischemic transformation to secondary AML, and it has a particularly poor prognosis, usually of less than 6 months. Coming back to polycythemia, it was first described by a French physician by the name Louis-Henri Vasquez in the late 1800s. It's probably one of the only diseases that really benefited from the habits of venesection in that area. But they present as a median age diagnosis is about 61 with an equal male to female occurrence. They can present asymptomatic and by incidental finding on a full blood count. They also can have quite a few other symptoms like constitutional symptoms with night sweats, weight loss, and fever due to the inflammatory and hypermetabolic state. Erythromelalgia can occur where they have warm, red, and painful distal extremities. Pruritus can be quite severe and often aquagenic, and that is due to the histamine release. Splenomegaly occur because of the extramedullary hematopoiesis and sometimes even hepatomegaly. And micro and circulatory disturbances due to hyperviscosity is also not uncommon with headaches and visual disturbances, chest pain, and distal paresthesias. Thrombosis can be arterial or venous, and it's often unexpected or at unusual sites like hepatic veins or splenic or even splanchnic upper extremities. So if you have a thrombosis at an unusual site, it's something to consider. Bleeding can also occur, and in about 4% patients will have severe bleeding events. Often these diseases can be masked by iron deficiency due to the high erythroid turnover. Iron is obviously consumed by the process. So in essence, sometimes we have to treat the patient with iron deficiency to get to a diagnosis. But at some point, people were saying you shouldn't treat the iron deficiency because it's just putting fuel to the fire. But what they did find is some patients do tend to have very severe symptoms like restless leg syndrome, and then patients do benefit with iron therapy if it's combined with cytoreductive therapy to slow down the bone marrow. So what do we need for a diagnosis of P. vera according to the WHO? We need 3 major or the first 2 minor criteria, major criteria with 1 minor. So usually we have to have an hemoglobin level in males above 16.5 grams or a hematocrit more than 49%, female 16 grams or a hematocrit of more than 48%. We have to have a hypercellular bone marrow with panmyelosis for age. So that just means all cell lines are increased. And we have to have a JAK2 V617 or an exon 12 mutation. If we do not have the JAK2 exon 2 mutation, then we have to have subnormal serum erythropoietin levels. What do we have to have for a post-P. vera myelofibrosis? We have to have a prior diagnosis of polycythemia with bone marrow fibrosis now, according to WHO, grade 2 or 3, if you use a different scale, 0 to 3. Additionally, you have to have 2 criteria, either a new anemia or a sustained loss of phlebotomy needs or cytoreductive therapy. Erythroblastosis or increased splenomegaly or new splenomegaly, or you have to have the development of 2 of the 3 constitutional symptoms, which includes weight loss, night sweats, or unexplained fever. So the 20-year incidence rates for a JAK2 V617 mutation to develop an arterial or venous thrombosis is about 26%, transformation rates through myelofibrosis 16%, and acute leukemia is 4%. Poor outcomes are predicted in older age, patients with leukocytosis or abnormal karyotypes, or if they have the presence of certain of the high-risk mutations. We do have scoring systems. There's not much time that we can go through them all, but basically some of them incorporate the karyotype mutations, others are more focused on age, thrombosis, and leukocytosis. So once they are risk stratified, we have tried out them some treatment plans, and the approach is basically for all patients to periodically phlebotomize them to keep the hematocrit below 45% in all patients with a low dose aspirin. If they are a low risk disease, meaning they don't have thrombosis and they are less than 60 years of age, we have to consider whether we want to add other therapies like maybe increase the aspirin dose if they have any risk of cardiovascular disease like hypertension, leukocytosis, or microvascular symptoms. Otherwise, we can consider pegylated interferon alpha if they need too many frequent phlebotomies, they complain about severe pleuritis, or they have severe symptomatic splenomegaly or persistent symptoms. Pegylated interferon is the only drug in a JAK2 V617F mutation that is shown to can induce molecular remission. So if you have a young patient that really wants to try and achieve that, you can also consider giving them pegylated interferon. In the higher disease risk group, we rather give them hydroxyurea as a starting point. If they have arterial thrombosis, we add aspirin twice daily. For venous thrombosis, we consider anticoagulant therapy. If they are intolerable to the side effects of hydroxyurea, we can also consider pegylated interferon, busulfan, or a JAK2 inhibitor. So essential thrombocythemia has been first described in the 1934 by two Austrian pathologists, Gibson and Goodall. And an annual incidence of ET is about 1.5 to 2 cases per 100,000 per year people. Median age onset 60 to 70, and the elderly are particularly at the increased risk of bleeding. But overall, the disease course is generally indolent. They can have complications by microcirculatory symptoms like headache, eye redness, and acral paresthesia. They also can have splenomegaly, but it's less likely that they will progress to myelofibrosis or acute myeloid leukemia. Risk factors for high risk include age over 60, anemia, leukocytosis, therapy resistance, very high platelet counts, and also certain of the somatic mutations. What do we need for a diagnosis of ET? We need all major criteria, or the first 3 major plus a minor. So you have to have a sustained platelet count above 450. The bone marrow needs to show proliferation in the megakaryocytes with the abnormal enlarged mature megakaryocytes. No evidence of an increase in granulopoiesis or erythropoiesis. The WHO criteria for CML, P vera, myelofibrosis should not be met, or any other myeloid neoplasm. And then this criteria unfortunately don't have the JAK2 calreticulin and MPL mutation, so that's the 4th one. If you do not have one of the driver mutations, you have to prove clonality with an undermarker or the absence of reactive thrombocytosis. For post-ET, we have to have a prior diagnosis of ET, and now having fibrosis grade 2 or 3, depending on the scale you use. Additionally, 2 other criteria: anemia, leukoerythroblastosis, splenomegaly, either new or increased, high LDH level, or constitutional symptoms as also seen in P vera. So just to point your attention again, when properly monitored and treated, these patients can have a normal life expectancy. So overall, in a very low risk group, you can have 47 years. So if that would be a normal life expectancy. But in the high risk, it can reduce to almost 8 years. And people with thrombosis are at high risk, older age, and JAK2 mutations are considered high risk. So basically, the treatment in the very low and low risk entails of aspirin, whether it's an increased dose or a low dose will depend if there is additional cardiovascular risk. just take note that if a patient has a very high platelet count before giving them aspirin, you have to consider screening him for acquired von Willebrand disease. Because of the increased platelet count, they absorb almost all the high molecular weight von Willebrand and you develop then an acquired von Willebrand. In the intermediate risk group, we tend to add hydroxyurea with a once daily aspirin. If there's cardiovascular risk, you can consider a twice daily aspirin dose. In the high risk group, we consider if they have arterial thrombosis or venous thrombosis history. And then we can add either anticoagulants according to the venous thrombosis group. If you have additional JAK2 MPL mutations or cardiovascular risk, if you have venous thrombosis, then you can also consider adding the aspirin to the systemic anticoagulation. Primary myelofibrosis has already been reported 140 years ago by a guy named Gustav Kirk. But it's only in 1951 that the myeloproliferative neoplasm category became known by Professor William Damaszek, who's also one of the founding fathers of the discipline of hematology. The disease is characterized by the abnormal proliferation of megakaryocytes and granulocytic lineages, progressive fibrosis, osteosclerosis, and extramedullary hematopoiesis. Depending on the stage, we classify them as pre-fibrotic or fibrotic. A third of patients will present asymptomatic at diagnosis, but often they will present with severe or significant massive splenomegaly and hepatomegaly, and also extramedullary lesions in a variety of organs. They are often in a hypermetabolic state with constitutional symptoms, with fatigue and bone pain, and they can also, as they tend to develop fibrosis, cytopenias can become quite significant and problematic to treat. So what do we need for a diagnosis of a primary myelofibrosis? Here we need all three major criteria and at least one minor. So usually they have megakaryocytic proliferation with less than a grade 1 or less fibrosis. They have an increased age-adjusted bone marrow cellularity with mainly granulocytic proliferation. No criteria for BCR-ABL, CML, PBL, ET, or MDS, or any other myeloid neoplasm should be met. JAK2 calreticulin or MPL mutation should be present, or another clonal marker, as mentioned. The minor criteria, if you do not have the JAK2 calreticulin MPL, then you have to have at least, you do have to have all major criteria and one minor. Either anemia, leukocytosis, palpable splenomegaly, or increased LDH. So for the fibrotic phase, you have to have all three major and at least one minor. Now you have still have the megakaryocytic proliferation, but you have now reticulin and or collagen fibrosis grade 2 or 3. You can have the JAK2 calreticulin or MPL mutation, or then another clonal marker, or absence of reactive fibrosis. The minor criteria includes that you have anemia, leukocytosis, palpable spleen, LDH, and now added to the list is leukoerythroplastosis. So patients with primary myelofibrosis, they found that the abnormal megakaryocytes have reduced expression of CALTA1 protein, and that leads to the severe pro-inflammatory cytokine release with growth factors that causes the inflammation that contributes to the bone marrow fibrosis and osteosclerosis. Survival varies dramatically. In the high risk, you can expect less than 3 years. This is decades in the low risk group. The median survival time for a pre-myelofibrosis is 14.7 years, and that's much shorter than an 80 that we expect a 31-year median survival time. It's even shorter in the survival for patients with fibrosis, because the leukemia-free survival is quite short, 7% at 5 years, increased to 23% at 10 years. In the ET group, we only have a 1% risk at 10 years. So it's very important that we do score these patients accurately, because it has significant implications because of the low survival rates. And there are in the WHO about 6 or 7 prognostic scoring systems. But the most advanced one is the Mutation Enhanced International prognostic scoring system that do incorporate not only clinical symptoms, but also genetic mutations and cytogenetic data. And that allows for better discrimination between this very high and high risk and the other risk stratification groups. Now I'm just going to skip that. So if we look at the treatment for myelofibrosis, the reason why we have to consider the risk groups is because very high risk, that should be high risk, is eligible for stem cell transplant because that's the only chance really of surviving longer than 3 years. So if they are eligible, then obviously stem cell transplant must be planned for. If they cannot tolerate the transplant for any specific reason, then obviously the same therapy will apply to the other lower, intermediate, and very low risk group. And here the therapy seems to be tailored according to the patient's needs because they can present with a variety of symptoms. For instance, patients with low platelet counts, or whether they have splenomegaly with or without anemia, are they having transfusion-dependent anemia, do they have a lot of constitutional symptoms? And lots of trials are currently undergoing to see what combination of medication is the best for these patients. So they are trying to add additional layers of treatment to see what the outcome will be. But basically, they can either receive the same hydroxyurea cytoreductive therapies, or they can receive pegylated interferon. And then in South Africa, we have one JAK inhibitor, ruxolitinib, that can also be used in this group depending on what the patient's needs are. There's just a list of all the JAK2 inhibitors. So as I've said, we just have the Jakafi available in South Africa, but unfortunately, as you can see, the common side effect is anemia and thrombocytopenia and a bit of a risk of infection. So you cannot use this drug then obviously in patients with really severe thrombocytopenia. We hope to have some of the other drugs available because then at least you can tailor your therapy to the patient's needs. Just a few last words on there are certain germline inheritance of rare hereditary mutations that can also lead to familial conditions, which is fairly rare, but that can resemble some of the myeloproliferative neoplasms. But they do not have the same risk of transformation to leukemia and fibrosis. And that there's just a list of those conditions. And as you can see, it depends on, it can be autosomal dominant, it can be autosomal recessive. But just to be aware of them, I don't really have time to go into detail in one of them. So that brings me to the end. And there's just my references.
Thank you so much. This is quite a in-depth presentation. And yeah, I think this is a topic that I always tend to shy away when I was at the medical school. It's like many chromosomes to remember.
Yeah.
And one other thing I think as a pulmonologist, we quite sometimes we get mixed between the ancestral thrombocytopenia and then polycythemia and of course secondary erythrocytosis.
Yeah.
And I think probably the distinguished factors normally being JAK2 mutation, but we know for the fact that some of those patients also could be JAK2 mutation negative.
Yeah.
How do you dissect between the two?
Okay, I have a little that might be a bit helpful, specifically in patients with JAK2 unmutated and erythrocytosis. So it helps if you have a family history. So if there's a family history, then you can use your erythropoietin levels to sort of try and help you, but obviously it's not always so helpful. But if it is low, then you can consider your EPO receptor mutations. You can look for high affinity hemoglobins, methemoglobin, and then obviously I think at that point in time you will probably have to consider asking a geneticist for advice on what mutations to test for and what is available. But if the JAK2, if the EPO is compensated normal or increased, if it's increased, you consider obviously your erythropoietin producing tumors. Things like renal artery stenosis or renal cyst, post-renal transplant erythrocytosis. And if your EPO level is compensated normal or increased, Then you consider conditions with obviously hypoxia, cardiovascular or obstructive sleep apnea. And one other thing that they do mention to look out for is a new SGLT2, SGLT2 drugs in diabetes, which tends to give you erythrocytosis. And that can be tricky sometimes then to distinguish. You have to actually stop the drug then and see if the erythrocytosis persists. And then if they do have a JAK2 mutation, then obviously you have to support them with venesections.
And then one of the key factor for polycythemia vera was always saying that, I think on the history taking, I think if you were in medical school, they tell you that if you get pruritus when you take shower with the cold water, warm water.
Yeah.
Why? What's the relation with that?
It's the histamine release, it's because of the deal that they say, I think, a lot of things are not really exactly known, but these conditions are associated with inflammation because of the receptors. It depends on the receptor that's affected, where the mutation is. So that obviously can activate inflammation. And part of the inflammation is histamine release. And then as you, then the pruritus is coming from the histamine that is released in the wall.
And then last question. Sorry. Anybody got a question? I just got the last one. It's a very exciting topic. And then the last about the indication of splenectomy. Could we consider splenectomy in patient with myelofibrosis?
That's a tricky one, and I think that would be obviously determined on the condition, and I'll tell you why. Because once the patient is in a fibrotic state, the complete hematopoiesis may occur in the spleen. And once you take out the spleen, you can then have severe cytopenias to deal with. So it's a tricky one. Even radiation is, it's irreversible. So either splenectomy or radiation can be devastating sometimes in certain conditions. So it is treated at a very individual level.
So I think it's actually contraindicated use that we should not.
Yeah.
I think as a physician during preoperative care, we should always, have a look at that to make sure the patient must have bone marrow, make sure the patient does not have underlying myelofibrosis. The only probably unless the patient got splenic rupture, that's completely something else completely.
Options.
Leanne?
I feel I'll do it also. It's not a topic that we deal with that often. Don't know a lot, so it was very helpful to go through and be reminded. And not that I can say it's a lot easier.
It is a workup, and in a PVNA, it's nice if you can do a peripheral blood JAK2 mutation and you can do it APO level, so that already helps a bit. But there is a bit of contradiction whether you should do a bone marrow in a PVNA where you already have a JAK2 and a low EPO.
Yes.
But some people argue and say, you still benefit by looking at the degree of fibrosis. And you also benefit by doing a karyotype.
Yes.
And look at the NGS and see if there is any high risk mutation. So risk stratification becomes a little bit more challenging if you don't do a bone marrow. But some people argue against it and some for it.
Jen, any question?
I
know you're itching to answer the question. I'm listening.
Yes. Can I add? So just to remember that it is a clonal dysfunction of the bone marrow that we believe is the trigger for the development of these kind of clonal conditions. So by removing the spleen is not going to necessarily help because the spleen is a compensatory extramedullary hemopoiesis that happens. So you actually have to treat the clonal abnormality. Also, the other thing to add on is the bone marrow is also important in the sense that you get some of these overlap cases, and also part of the criteria for diagnosis is morphology. So the bone marrow should not be considered something that you can avoid. The moment you have a suspicion, I always say, do a bone marrow. We need to see what the morphological changes are. Also to remember that NGS is there, and we can also get quite a few mutations that can be associated with these conditions, and kind of like guide us into a diagnosis. So just to say that there is a place for a bone marrow. Splenectomy is really, really not advised. And also the ruxolitinib, one of the measures of response is to see the splenic regression.
And then Dr. Kohli, any questions?
No question, Doc. Great presentation. Good morning.
Yeah, and then I think anybody else? I think I have something slip my mind. But all right, I think again, if you look at the initial beginning of the presentation, she mentioned about the chip. That's, I think we have that on our podcast. So I think perhaps if you're really interested in hematology, maybe you could start reading about it. Also watch the podcast about chip, and obviously that one, I think we're going to connect together. So it looks like we actually done a very good profile of the myeloproliferative disease, because we have really good content on the system for the student fellows, and I think really very good content. Thank you so much.